They watched you closely, studied your moves, predicted your steps, whispered to each other like they had already won. Control. That's what they believed they had. A neat little illusion wrapped in overconfidence. They thought you were just another piece on their board, easy to corner, easy to break. But what they never understood is this: silence doesn't mean weakness. It means calculation. While they were busy celebrating imaginary victories, you were observing, adapting, sharpening something far more dangerous than force. Precision. You didn't react. You didn't panic. You didn't even flinch. And that's what unsettled them. Because the moment they realized they weren't in control, it was already too late. They believed control was something you could hold in your hands, something solid, something certain. Like a switch they could flip whenever things didn't go their way. They built their confidence on routines, on patterns, on the idea that people behave in predictable ways. And for a while it worked. It always does. People fall into lines, follow expectations, repeat mistakes. It creates a comforting rhythm, a sense that everything is exactly where it should be. So they watched you and tried to fit you into that same pattern. They labeled you, defined you, reduced you to something simple enough to manage. In their minds, you were already understood, already solved. Every move you made, they thought they had seen before. Every silence, they interpreted as hesitation. Every pause, as uncertainty. It made them feel powerful, like they were always one step ahead. But control like that isn't real. It's a fragile illusion built on assumptions, and assumptions have a way of collapsing the moment reality refuses to cooperate. They never questioned their own perspective. Why would they? It had always worked for them. They were used to people reacting, to emotions spilling out at the right time, to fear revealing itself in obvious ways. They expected resistance to look loud, obvious, desperate. Something they could quickly identify and shut down. What they weren't prepared for was something quieter. Something that didn't follow their script. You didn't give them what they expected. No reaction, no clear signal, nothing they could grab onto and control. And that's where the cracks began to form. At first, it confused them. Small inconsistencies they brushed off, telling themselves it didn't matter. But confusion has a way of growing when it's ignored. The more they tried to predict you, the more uncertain they became. Their confidence started shifting, just slightly, just enough to make them question things they once believed were certain. Because when control is real, it doesn't need to be questioned. It doesn't slip. It doesn't hesitate. The truth is, they were never in control of you. They were in control of a version of you that only existed in their imagination. A version shaped by their expectations, their assumptions, their need to feel dominant. And when that version stopped matching reality, they didn't know how to respond. They kept trying to adjust, to force the situation back into something familiar. But every attempt only made it clearer that something was wrong. The rules they relied on didn't apply anymore. The patterns broke. The predictability disappeared, and that's when control turns into something else. Doubt. It creeps in quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A hesitation before action, a second thought where there used to be certainty. It makes them slower, less precise, less confident. And the more they try to hold on to control, the more it slips through their fingers, because control was never something they truly had. It was something they believed they had, and belief is easy to break when it's built on something that was never real to begin with. They were waiting for you to react. That was the plan from the beginning. Push, provoke, apply pressure, and watch for the cracks. People always reveal themselves when they feel cornered. A raised voice, a rushed decision, a visible shift in composure. That's how they measured strength. That's how they stayed in control. So they created noise around you. Subtle at first, then louder, more deliberate. Little tests designed to pull something out of you. A mistake, a reaction, anything they could read, analyze, and use. They leaned in, watching closely, convinced that sooner or later you would follow the same predictable script as everyone else. But you didn't. You stayed quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from fear or confusion. Not the kind that hesitates or hides. This was different. Intentional. Controlled. The kind of silence that listens more than it speaks. That watches without being noticed. And that unsettled them more than any reaction ever could. Because when someone reacts, they give something away. Emotion becomes information. Movement becomes a pattern. It gives others something to hold on to, something to predict. But silence offers nothing. No clear direction, no obvious weakness, no easy interpretation. They started filling in the gaps themselves. That's what people do when they don't understand something. They guess. They assume. They create explanations just to make sense of the unknown, and every assumption they made pushed them further away from the truth. You let them believe you were unaware. You let them think they were leading, that they were setting the pace. Meanwhile, you were watching everything. The way they spoke, the timing of their actions, the moments they hesitated without realizing it, the small details they thought no one would notice. Observation isn't passive, it's precise. It's selective. It filters out noise and focuses on what actually matters. While they were busy trying to provoke you, you were studying them, learning their patterns, their habits, their blind spots. They thought silence meant emptiness. They never considered it could mean focus. The more they tried to pull a reaction from you, the more exposed they became. Frustration started creeping into their actions. Subtle at first, then more visible. They repeated themselves, pushed harder, became less careful, and every time they did, they revealed just a little bit more. That's the thing about people who rely on control. When it starts slipping, they don't slow down. They push harder. Thinking force will fix what patience once held together. And in doing so, they make themselves easier to read. You didn't interrupt. You didn't correct them. You didn't rush to take advantage of what you were seeing. You just kept watching. Because timing matters more than movement. Acting too soon gives away intention. Acting too late loses opportunity. But waiting, truly waiting, gives you something they don't even realize they're offering. Clarity. By the time they noticed something was off, they couldn't pinpoint what it was. There was no obvious mistake. No single moment they could trace it back to. Just a growing discomfort, a sense that they were no longer as certain as they once were. And uncertainty makes people predictable in ways they never expect. They assumed waiting was a sign of hesitation, that if you didn't act immediately, It meant you were unsure, unprepared, or afraid to move. In their world, speed looked like confidence. Quick decisions, fast reactions, constant motion. It gave the illusion of control, like momentum itself was proof of power. So they moved fast, too fast. Every action they took was driven by the need to stay ahead, to maintain the image that they were always in charge. They didn't like stillness. Stillness forced them to think, and thinking created doubt. So they filled every moment with movement, convincing themselves that as long as they were doing something, they were winning. And then there was you. You didn't rush. You didn't feel the need to respond to every move, to match their pace, or to prove anything in the moment. While they were sprinting, you were standing still, watching them exhaust themselves. Not out of laziness, not out of fear, but because you understood something they didn't. Time isn't the enemy. It's a tool. They treated every second like it was slipping away, something to be chased and controlled. You treated it like something to be shaped, something that works in your favor if you know how to use it. While they rushed into decisions, you let decisions come to you. While they reacted, you considered. Patience isn't passive. It's controlled restraint. It means you see the impulse to act, and you choose not to. You feel the pressure building around you, the expectation to move, to respond, to prove something, and you let it pass, because acting under pressure reveals more about you than you intend. It exposes urgency, and urgency can be manipulated. They relied on that. They expected you to feel it, to break under it, to make a move just to relieve it. But you didn't. You let the pressure sit there unanswered. And slowly it shifted. What was meant to push you started turning back on them. Because pressure doesn't disappear when it's ignored. It builds. It grows heavier. And when it doesn't get the reaction it was designed for, it begins to affect the one applying it. They started feeling it instead. The longer you waited, the more uncomfortable they became. Questions started forming. Why aren't you reacting? What are you thinking? What are you planning? The silence stretched longer than they expected, and with every passing moment, their certainty weakened. Patience gave you something they didn't have anymore. Control over timing. You weren't bound by their pace, their expectations, or their attempts to rush the outcome. You were operating on your own terms, in your own time. And that made everything you did harder to predict, harder to counter, harder to stop. Because when someone is patient, truly patient, they don't just wait, they choose the moment. And that moment is never random. It comes when the other side is tired, when their focus slips, when their confidence isn't as sharp as it used to be. It comes when they've shown enough of themselves without realizing it, when their patterns are clear, when their mistakes have already been made. They thought you were falling behind. They never realized you were letting them move ahead, just far enough to lose balance. They believed dominance was loud. That power had to be seen, heard, asserted in obvious ways. Strong words, visible authority, constant reminders of who was in charge. That's how they measured it. That's how they maintained it. If people looked intimidated, if they reacted, if they followed without question, then everything was working exactly as intended. So they performed control like it was a spectacle. Every move calculated for visibility, every decision framed to reinforce their position. They needed others to see it, to acknowledge it, to respond to it. Because without that reaction, without that validation, their sense of dominance started to feel uncertain. And then they looked at you. No reaction, no visible resistance, no submission either, just composure, steady, quiet, unmoved. At first, they mistook it for compliance. It was easier that way. If you weren't challenging them openly, then you must have accepted their authority. That's how it usually works. People either resist or they fold. Those are the two options they understood. But you weren't doing either. You weren't playing the role they expected, because dominance isn't always about controlling others. Sometimes it's about controlling yourself so completely that nothing external can shift you. No pressure, no intimidation, no attempt to provoke a reaction. They tried anyway. Subtle pushes, then stronger ones. Testing boundaries, watching for cracks. They expected something to slip eventually. A moment of frustration, a sign of discomfort, anything they could use to re-establish their sense of control. But every attempt met the same response. Nothing. And that's where things started to change. Because when someone can't read you, they can't predict you. And when they can't predict you, they can't control the outcome. Their usual methods stopped working, one by one. The tactics that used to create reactions now fell flat. The pressure they applied didn't land the way it used to. It didn't disappear. It reflected. Every push they made, every attempt to assert dominance, only made their own intentions more visible. Their need for control became obvious. Their reliance on reactions became clear. And the more they tried, the more they revealed. You didn't need to challenge them directly. You didn't need to compete for control in the way they understood it. You just remained unchanged. And that's what started to unsettle them. Because real psychological dominance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't rely on constant reinforcement. It exists quietly beneath the surface, shaping the situation without being seen. It shifts the balance without making a sound. They started second, guessing themselves. Small hesitations at first, a pause before speaking, a slight delay in action. They began questioning whether their approach was working, whether they were still in control of the situation, and doubt changes behavior. It makes movements less certain, decisions less sharp. It introduces hesitation where there used to be confidence. And once that hesitation appears, it doesn't go away easily. You didn't create that doubt by force. You allowed it to grow by giving them nothing to hold on to. Because when someone is used to controlling others, the one thing they can't handle is someone who can't be controlled. They relied on patterns. Everyone does. It makes the world easier to manage when actions follow familiar sequences, when behavior fits into something that can be studied, anticipated, controlled. They built their confidence on that predictability. If they could read the pattern, they could stay ahead of it. So they tried to map you out. Every move you made became part of their analysis. They watched for repetition, for habits, for anything that looked consistent enough to turn into a formula. Because once something becomes a formula, it becomes controllable. That's how they stayed comfortable. That's how they stayed confident. At first, they thought they saw it. A rhythm in your actions, a logic they believed they understood. It gave them a false sense of clarity. They started preparing responses before you even acted, convinced they already knew what was coming next. That confidence made them bold. It made them careless, because what they were seeing wasn't a pattern. It was a setup. You let them believe they understood you. You let them see just enough consistency to feel certain, just enough repetition to build expectations. And once those expectations were in place, once they started relying on them, you shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, just enough, a slight change in timing, a different choice where they expected a familiar one, a response that didn't match the situation the way it should have. Small deviations that broke their predictions without fully revealing your intent. And suddenly, their confidence had nothing to stand on. Because unpredictability isn't chaos. It's controlled variation. It's knowing exactly when to follow a pattern and exactly when to break it. Too much consistency makes you readable. Too much randomness makes you ineffective. But the balance between the two creates something far more difficult to deal with, something they couldn't track. They started second, guessing their own assumptions. The patterns they thought they had figured out no longer worked. Every time they tried to apply the same logic, it failed in a slightly different way, and failure, even in small amounts, starts to erode confidence. They adjusted, tried to rebuild their understanding, looked for new patterns, new signals, anything they could rely on again. But you didn't give them stability. Just when they thought they were close to figuring it out, you shifted again. Not randomly, not emotionally, but deliberately. Always just enough to keep them uncertain, just enough to keep them questioning. And uncertainty changes everything. It slows decision-making. It creates hesitation. It forces people to think longer than they should, to doubt choices they would normally make without question. And while they were busy trying to figure you out, they stopped focusing on their own actions. That's where the real advantage formed. Because while they were analyzing you, you already understood them. Their need for patterns, their reliance on predictability, their discomfort with uncertainty. You saw how they reacted when things didn't go as planned, how quickly confidence turned into frustration when control slipped away. Unpredictable precision isn't about being erratic. It's about being exact in ways they can't anticipate. Every move still had purpose. Every shift still had direction. But from their perspective, it looked inconsistent, impossible to pin down, impossible to prepare for. And when someone can't prepare, they start reacting. And reaction is exactly where they become vulnerable. They thought fear had to be forced. Raised voices, sharp threats, visible pressure. Something loud enough to shake confidence. Obvious enough to make someone step back. That's how they understood it. Fear, to them, was something you create through intensity. So they relied on it. They made their presence heavy, their words deliberate, their actions designed to remind others of consequences. It worked on people who reacted quickly, who showed discomfort, who revealed just enough emotion to confirm that the pressure was landing. But you didn't give them that. No visible tension, no defensive posture, no urgency to respond or explain. Just a steady, controlled composure that didn't shift no matter what they tried. At first, they didn't see it as a threat. It looked like indifference, maybe even weakness. Because in their experience, People who weren't affected usually just didn't understand the situation. They assumed you hadn't realized what was happening yet, so they pushed harder. More pressure, more intensity, more effort to break through whatever calm you were holding on to. They expected a reaction eventually. Everyone reacts eventually. That's what they believed. But the reaction never came, and that's when something unfamiliar started to settle in. Not the kind of fear they were used to creating, but something quieter, something harder to explain. Because fear doesn't always come from what is seen or heard. Sometimes it comes from what isn't, from what can't be read, from what doesn't respond the way it should. Your composure didn't just resist their pressure, it reflected it. Every attempt they made to control the situation came back unanswered, unchanged, leaving them with nothing to measure, nothing to confirm that they were still in control. And without confirmation, confidence begins to slip. They started noticing it in small ways. A slight pause before speaking. A moment of hesitation where there used to be certainty. They became more aware of their own actions, more cautious, more unsure of how they were being perceived. Because when someone remains completely composed under pressure, it creates a question that doesn't have an easy answer. What do they know that I don't? That question lingers. It repeats itself quietly in the background, influencing decisions, slowing reactions, introducing doubt into places where there used to be clarity. And the more they tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. They began watching you differently, not with confidence, but with caution, trying to find something, anything, that would explain the calm, that would make it predictable again. But composure like that doesn't offer explanations. It doesn't reveal itself easily. It just stays, unmoved, unrushed, unaffected. And that's where the shift happens. Because fear created through force fades when the pressure is removed. But fear created through uncertainty stays. It builds quietly, without needing constant reinforcement. It grows in the absence of answers, in the space where understanding should be but isn't. They couldn't predict you. They couldn't read you. They couldn't influence you in the ways they were used to, and that made every move they considered feel risky. Every decision carried doubt. Every action felt like it could be the wrong one, not because you threatened them, not because you showed aggression, but because you didn't show anything at all. Composure became the thing they couldn't break, couldn't measure, couldn't control, and what they couldn't control started to control how they felt